Are you for or against GMOs? Do you think we should be eating GMO food? No matter what your opinion is, you're going to learn a lot about GMO food in this program. I'm going to bust a lot of myths about GMO, and at the end of this program, you're going to have a changed opinion about GMO. What is a GMO? Almost everyone has a strong opinion for or against GMOs, but the surprising thing is that we don't actually have a good definition of what they are. That's one of the reasons we can't agree on whether or not we should be eating these things. The letters GMO stand for genetically modified organisms, but that's pretty vague. I know that a lot of you think a GMO plant is where we take a plant and inject some DNA from some other kind of organism. You probably heard about fish genes being put into plants. Now that is one definition. And some people couple that with the idea that this transfer of DNA has to happen in a lab. So if we make a new plant and it's done in the lab, that's a GMO. But as you'll see, that's not really true. What about the case where I take a plant and I take DNA from a completely different kind of plant and I put it into the first plant? Is that a GMO? Does it have to be a different organism? What about the case where DNA from a non-plant organism moves into a plant and it's done by nature? No lab involved. Is that a GMO? Now in nature what happens is that pollen moves from one plant to another and we create new plants. DNA is combined from two different organisms. That is perceived as being okay, and most of us would not consider that as a GMO. The fact that it's done in a lab is also not really important, because as I've mentioned, nature can take DNA from a non-plant organism and move it into a plant without man or labs involved. You can see where the definition of GMO, particularly by the general public, is a little fuzzy. Originally, the term GMO was applied to a specific laboratory procedure where scientists went to one organism, took out some DNA, and moved it to a second organism. And they called that a GMO procedure. And it produced a GMO plant. The general public got involved and they changed that definition. To them, anytime we take foreign DNA and get it into a plant, that's a GMO. But what about the case where we don't physically move DNA around? There's a type of French wheat called rennet, and that was produced many years ago by taking wheat seeds and seeds from two other species, putting them together in a test tube, and adding a carcinogen. Carcinogens are known to affect the DNA in organisms. It basically scrambles the DNA. That mixture then was exposed to X-rays, and X-rays also affect the DNA. They change it. After all these procedures, some of the seeds germinated and produced a wheat that was much more resistant to diseases, and we started cultivating it. And as far as I know, we're still growing that wheat. Now, it was never labeled a GMO, but the procedure scrambled the DNA around. Now, this procedure became known as mutagenesis, creating mutants in the seeds. It was done in a lab, but we never transferred DNA, and it's not called a GMO. Now, what's the difference? We take some DNA from here and move it to here, or we take DNA from several different types of seeds and we put carcinogens in and X-rays in and we just manipulate that DNA and screw it all around until we get a new type of plant. Is there really any difference? Why is it that we're against one and the other one is quite acceptable? Have you ever eaten a sweet potato? Well, thousands of years ago, nature came along and did some DNA manipulation. There's a bacteria called Agrobacterium. It's able to take its own DNA and insert it into a plant. And that's what it did. The resulting combination is the sweet potato. Now, there was no lab involved and man wasn't involved. Good old trusted nature did this for us. And they produced the sweet potato. The sweet potato can be considered to be a natural GMO. DNA from a bacteria was transferred into a plant, produced a whole new type of plant. And we consider this plant completely healthy and safe to eat. Nobody is banning sweet potatoes because they're a GMO. A number of years ago, Monsanto developed a compound called Roundup. That's used to kill weeds on plants. And then they manipulated some plants to become Roundup resistant. That meant that they could spray Roundup on these plants, kill the weeds, but it wouldn't affect the plant. We call that Roundup Ready. And these plants were created by moving DNA into a plant using the agrobacterium DNA. In effect, what Monsanto did was they copied what nature did in creating the sweet potato. It's virtually the same technique. They just did it in a lab. Now that we all recognize as being a GMO plant. As you can see, the definition of GMO is very confusing, and we really don't have a good definition. But I think the general public considers a GMO to be anything where we've taken DNA from one species and put it in another one and did that manipulation in a laboratory. So let's go with that definition. Well, I'm glad we solved that problem. No, we haven't really solved the problem, because it turns out that that technique of moving DNA has been around for quite a while, and there's better techniques out now. One of them is called CRISPR. CRISPR is a new way to move DNA from one organism into another. And in fact, CRISPR was used to make some of the vaccines for COVID. Almost everybody accepted those vaccines. I mean, people were against vaccines in general, but I didn't see too many people complain that we used CRISPR technology to create them. What's really interesting is that this newer technology, CRISPR, is not producing GMOs. And yet what it does, it moves DNA from a foreign organism into the plant. There's really no difference between GMO and CRISPR. And there's going to be newer techniques coming along. So we're back to where we were when we started. We don't really have a good definition for GMO. I find it both amusing and very concerning that so many people have strong opinions about this. And yet we can't actually even define what it is they're for or against. As gardeners, you've probably noticed that almost every seed packet is now stamped non-GMO. Seed catalogs have it in big letters. We sell no GMO seeds. Well, this is kind of funny because it's all marketing hype. Up until this year, gardeners have not been able to buy GMO seed. There isn't a single GMO vegetable available in those little packets. And the first GMO flour only became available last year. So this message of not selling GMO seed, complete marketing mumbo jumbo. Now, things have really changed in the past year. Last year, the announcement was that gardeners were now going to be able to buy the firefly petunia. This is a bioluminescent petunia, and it's a GMO. I just checked online, and you can still buy it, at least in the US. In the last few months, the big story has been about the new purple GMO tomato. It's been developed over 20 years, and it's considered a GMO. What breeders did was they took DNA from a snapdragon and put it into a tomato to create that purple color. And this fruit is not only purple on the outside, but it's purple on the inside. Those seeds are available for the first time this year. It's only available in the US because that's the only country that has approved this GMO tomato. Think about this. We've taken DNA from a plant and put it into a plant, and we're calling that a GMO. So it doesn't have to be DNA from a foreign species. It can be from another plant. One of the big misconceptions people have is that all of the food we eat is natural food. It's either been created by nature, or man has gone in and moved some pollen from one plant to another. But we consider that natural pollination, even though we've helped it along a little bit. Well, that's not true. In fact, a lot of the food we eat is the result of manipulation of that DNA. And this has been going on for about 100 years now, and the activity really increased after the Second World War. A lot of products we eat have been created through mutagenesis. And there's a mutant variety database that holds over 3,000 of these plants. The way these are created is by taking seed and exposing it to carcinogens and X-rays, various techniques that mutate the DNA. Then we grow it, eat it, and we're all happy with it. It's not GMO. We consider this a natural process. Well, it's not natural. It's man-made. It's actually made in a laboratory. Now, the reason people don't have concerns over this is really twofold. One is the food's safe. There's really no concern. The second reason is that people don't know that that's how this food was actually produced. Now, mutagenesis has been used to produce grapefruits, rice, wheat, barley, soybeans, pears, peas, cotton, peppermint, sunflower, peanuts, sesame, bananas, cassava, sorghum. There's a long list of plants that you've been eating. They're all artificially made by man using carcinogens. Because these are not GMO, they can be used in every country around the world, even all those countries that have outlawed GMOs. And I suspect that some of the seed that you've been buying has actually been made this way. These genes may also be part of your heirloom. Certified organic farmers are not allowed to use GMO seed, but they are allowed to use seed that's created through mutagenesis. Now, that doesn't make any sense to me. When we make a GMO, we take a very specific strand of DNA, we move it into the new plant, we know exactly what we're doing, we do lots of testing to make sure it's safe. Now with mutagenesis, we take some seeds, we throw in a bunch of carcinogens, it scrambles all the DNA, we have no idea what's happened, and we consider that safe. We don't have to do a lot of testing on that seed either. And as an aside, I actually did my master's research on the effects of carcinogens on human DNA. We really don't know what kind of damage they've done, and yet those are safe and can be used everywhere, including on organic farms. Is GMO food safe to eat? We've been eating it for 40 some years, and there are no examples of that food causing a health problem. Everything that science has done to test this food has shown that it's perfectly safe to eat. And I'm not surprised at that. And in fact, most scientists aren't surprised. 90% of scientists consider GMO food safe to eat, whereas only 50% of the general population considers it safe. I think the disconnect between those two numbers stems from the fact that scientists actually understand how this DNA manipulation happens. More importantly, they understand how natural pollination is not a very controlled process. When bees do the pollination, we think it's natural, and we equate that to being good, safe, and healthy. But what happens when a bee moves that pollen? Well, the pollen has thousands of genes in it. Those are mixed with thousands of genes from the mother plant. We jumble them all up. We have no idea what the changes are. We do virtually no testing of that new plant. We just start cultivating it and eating it, and we consider it safe. That really doesn't make any sense. Once you understand the actual technology that's taking place, once you understand how this DNA is manipulated and how it works in a cell, you realize that the production of a GMO is much safer than natural pollination. And mutagenesis is even less safe. Now, I know some of you are sitting there thinking, this guy can't be right. I mean, we've been pollinating plants and breeding plants naturally for hundreds of years, and we've never had any problem with those plants. Well, that's not true. Let me give you a couple examples. Potatoes contain some natural toxins, things like solanine, but the levels are pretty low and they don't actually harm us. Well, a number of years ago, breeders came up with a new type of potato, and this was developed naturally in the field. The potato was called Lanapa. It was very disease resistant. Now, the reason it was disease resistant was that the plant created much larger amounts of toxin than most potatoes. Now, these toxins are natural pesticides that the plant makes. And in the breeding program, we developed some that insects would leave alone because they had very high levels. Now, this isn't pesticide that we spray on. We're talking about pesticides that the plant actually makes itself. It turns out that these potatoes had such a high level of this natural pesticide that it was too toxic for us to eat. We basically created a poisonous potato, and it had to be taken off the market. In fact, since then, most new breeds of potatoes are tested for these toxins. In another case, we developed some celery that again was very pest resistant. And we started growing this celery and shipping it across the country. And what we found was that people that were exposed to it, people working on the farms and even people in grocery stores that were handling it, they started having rashes and blisters on their skin. Turns out that this celery created a toxin that reacted with light and created skin reactions. You might know the giant hogweed. It's a beautiful plant with huge leaves. The problem is the toxin from that plant gives you rashes and irritates you, creates blisters. It can blind you. It's a very toxic plant. Well, what we had done through natural breeding, we had created a celery that did the same thing. It too had to be pulled from the market because it was dangerous to eat. So if you think that natural pollination produces food that's safe, you're wrong. Now, most of it is safe, but there are cases when it's not. The same is true for any kind of DNA manipulation we do. Most of it will be safe to eat, and there's always a possibility that it won't be. The difference between GMOs and all these other techniques is that GMOs are highly tested, and we know exactly which DNA we're moving. A lot of people are against GMOs because they associate them with Roundup and Monsanto. And they hate Roundup, so they hate GMOs. That's completely illogical. GMOs and Roundup are not really related. Now, granted, there are some GMOs that are Roundup ready, but most GMOs are not Roundup ready. Most GMOs have nothing to do with Roundup. Most of them are actually created to be pest and disease resistant, and some are created to create food that tastes better or has higher nutritional value. GMOs also have very little to do with Monsanto. Most GMOs are not made by Monsanto. Look at it this way. If we created Roundup ready plants using natural breeding, let the bees do it, and we just find this new cultivar and it's resistant to Roundup, and we start using that in our fields, are you going to be against GMOs for that reason? Of course not. The two are unrelated. Roundup and GMOs are two different subjects, and we should discuss each one of those on their own merits and understand any issues as separate issues. Roundup Ready seeds has become a big business, and I know a lot of you blame the big corporations for getting really rich on these, but you forget one little thing. Farmers are also getting rich. They make money because they have to spray their fields less. They get higher yields when they use these crops. So both farmers and companies are benefiting. That's absolutely true. Well, a number of years ago, the EU decided, well, let's ban GMOs. We don't like GMOs. Now, that wasn't based on science. That was based on popular opinion. But when most of the voters are against GMOs, well, you ban GMOs. And they did that. The farmers suffered. So what happened? So what scientists did was they started developing plants that were resistant to various types of herbicides. And they did that through mutagenesis, carcinogens and x-rays. And they developed some plants that you could spray with a herbicide and you wouldn't kill the plant. That was great for the farmers. One big downside to this, instead of Roundup, those farmers are now using other types of herbicides which are much more toxic than Roundup. But the general population wouldn't recognize the names of those compounds, so there's no concern. They'd rather eat a more toxic herbicide than Roundup. Another thing I hear a lot is that GMOs have resulted in the use of a lot of Roundup. There's a huge increase in herbicide use. Well, I got news for you. Herbicide use was there long before we made GMOs, and it was increasing quite steadily. In fact, when GMOs came along, the rate actually decreased a little bit because farmers didn't have to spray so much. In more recent years, in the last 15 years or so, the studies are pretty clear on that. We're still using more and more herbicide, but on a global basis, we're using more toxic herbicides than Roundup. And some of that is due to the fact that certain countries are not allowed to use GMOs. So in fact, GMOs are reducing the rate of increase of our use of herbicides. They're slowing that increase down. That's a good thing for the environment, and it makes for healthier food. As I mentioned, most GMOs are actually produced to create crops that are more pest resistant. If we can create a corn or wheat that is more resistant to insects, we not only get a higher yield, but we end up spraying less insecticide. And that's exactly what's happening. There's a large insecticide company in Brazil that's gone out of business because people didn't need their insecticide anymore. The farmers had switched to GMO seed, sprayed a whole lot less insecticide, and the company went bankrupt. That's not good for the company, but it's great for the environment and our health. Another argument against GMOs is that they're increasing the number of natural superweeds. These are weeds that are resistant to Roundup, another herbicide. Now, it is true that we are seeing more of these kinds of weeds. What is not true is that it's caused by the GMOs. We were creating superweeds long before GMOs came along. And whether a plant is a GMO or not, whether it's herbicide resistant or not, we're still going to spray herbicides. As long as we're spraying herbicides, we're going to create these super weeds. The best way for us to actually stop doing this is to create plants that fight weeds on their own. You know, if we could develop some plants that are allelopathic towards the weeds, the plants themselves would get rid of the weeds and we wouldn't have to spray herbicide. Now, we don't have those yet, but I'm sure scientists are working on that. Super weeds are a problem, but they're not caused by GMO. So let me summarize what we know about GMOs. It is a manipulation of DNA. But we've been doing that forever. There's really no difference between a scientist taking a very specific DNA and moving it into another plant and just jumbling DNA around using pollen. On a molecular basis, they're the same. And in fact, GMO methods are much safer because we know what we're doing and we test them more. Mutagenesis is used a lot, and in my opinion, it's not as safe. There's no evidence that the GMOs we're using today are producing food that's dangerous or toxic to us. And in fact, GMOs are going to become more nutritious for us. I talked briefly about the purple tomato. That tomato is purple because it contains a large number of antioxidants. It's one of those superfoods like blueberries and blackberries. It's much healthier for you than regular tomatoes. Now, we've just scratched the surface of what we can do with GMOs. Going forwards, we're going to create plants that are much more productive and use much lower amounts of fertilizer. We're going to create plants that need far less amounts of insecticides and herbicides. We can create plants that are nutritious for us. GMOs are here to stay. They're safe and they're extremely useful for us going forward. And most scientists agree with me. Stop listening to the fearmongers that are against GMOs. The science on this is pretty solid. Now, does that mean we won't create some weird plants with GMOs? Absolutely not. We have to look at each one of these, evaluate it, and test it really well. But I would really encourage you to learn more about GMOs and stop being scared about them. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to know more about gardening myths, have a look at this video right here. And if you want to learn about that purple GMO tomato, check this video here. Happy gardening.